And now back to our program, and it is a great honor, really, to introduce to you, for purposes of conveying greetings to the conference, His Excellency Jacek Chodorowicz, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland. So please welcome the Ambassador. Thank you.
I would like to thank you people and those who have been coordinating the preparations to the conference, and I would like to thank Professor Alex Grot in English, so he would understand my Polish as well, and Tony Tanke. I'd like to thank you very much, the host and the director of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, Herzl Makow. Thank you very much. We've been working together with the center for years, and we never missed a chance to be here with you, and 2 consecutive visits by the President of the Republic of Poland has included the visit to the center and opening with the last visit of the President Komorowski, and opening of the exhibition which was devoted to the children of Tehran. I would like to ask Larry Weinbaum, the director of the World Jewish Congress Research Institute in Jerusalem and the chief editor of the Israeli Journal of Foreign Affairs. If you read Larry's CV, my own CV, I'm not encouraging you to do that, but still, and Professor Stola, who will be speaking after me, you will discover that we are all the same prodigy. We are all members of the Faculty of History at the University of Warsaw at exactly the same time. So we are not hiding that, we are colleagues. Let me make 2 brief points relating to the substance of the conference. Professor Stola will be speaking shortly after me about the Polish government in exile, being the legal representative of the largest group of the Holocaust victims and of the land where most of the killing took place. He will, however, he will not tell you, but I should, as I'm not a scholar, that in our opinion, the government in exile has done its utmost to make known the events happening in the death camps and the events surrounding the Holocaust of the Jews. Has done utmost in a difficult circumstances, which we all know, and we as the Poles are proud of that. We are proud that there have been men like Karski with the courage, but also men like Karski, who has been, and it's important to remember, were not the lone wolves. They were instructed, they were representative of the government of Poland in exile, who were instructed to go around the world, to knock at every door with the message about the Holocaust. And the second point, We have been last month celebrating the 25th anniversary of re-establishing diplomatic relations between Poland and Israel in 1990. And that is around the same time which we have started to see the increase in the number of the publications in Poland, in the increase in numbers, increase in scope of the publications related to the Holocaust, which after this 25 years is impressive collective work of the researchers from different disciplines. And we can say I might be not an objective observer, but that it's hardly without the job being done in the last quarter of the century by these researchers in Poland to be in line with the history of the Holocaust these days. We encourage you to further work with the researchers from Poland, to join us in an effort to translate as many works published in Poland to other languages, because this is often a barrier. And we help together with the Polish Institute to also in Israel to bring young people who want to learn Polish, also to learn Polish, to be able to read, to understand what is in archives, but what is also the work in being done in this last quarter of the century about the Holocaust by the Polish historians. I will invite Dariusz, as I understand, to be the next speaker, and I thank you very much. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Stola. Dariusz Stola is a historian, professor at the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences, and fellow at the Center for Migration Research at Warsaw University. Since March 2014, he has served as director of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, a museum which we just saw and which is fabulous. He has published 10 books and more than 100 articles on the history of Polish-Jewish relations, the communist regime in Poland, and international migrations in the 20th century. The title of his paper is More Than Reactions to the Holocaust, the Polish Government in Exile, Policy in Jewish Matters. Dziękujemy bardzo, panie profesorze, i proszę bardzo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for these two introductions. Actually, yes, I did study at the Warsaw University. While Laurie was there and the ambassador was there, I think I was a little bit younger at that time, no longer. So I'm very glad that the Polish government in exile is so well covered in this conference, while it was a very minor partner in the anti-German coalition, one of the weakest. And we have heard in the previous paper by Michael Fleming, who analyzed in such a detail the information policy of the British government, including handling of the information provided by the Polish government. We'll have another paper by Professor Wojtek Rapak tomorrow on Karski. And so when I heard that we have Poland so well represented, my initial idea was not to focus so much on the reactions of the Polish government in exile to the news of the Holocaust, which are the topic of this conference, the response to but speak about some other topics which, in my opinion, to a large extent conditioned what the Polish government did or did not in reaction to the Holocaust. I will stay with this initial idea, although I will extend my original plan into some reactions to the Holocaust, which I believe crucial, especially in the context of the domination of the theme of reactions to the idea of bombing Auschwitz or bombing the railroads to Auschwitz. Because I believe there is some misunderstanding about what was the demand of the Jewish underground in Poland in that matters. So first, let me tell you a few words about the government exile, its structure, its nature, and how it affected, during the time of war, its Jewish policies. And what it did in Jewish matters before the news of the Holocaust reached London and before Polish politicians in exile couldn't understand what they meant, because these were two different moments. Because I believe there is a kind of a path dependency, namely, the government exile policy in Jewish matters had been largely formed before General Sikorski and other members of the Polish cabinet in London realized that the Germans had a specifically anti-Jewish, pan-European killing policy. So first, when we speak about British, American, Soviet government and Polish, there is an obvious difference, namely the Polish one does not control its territory, which means all the resources that Allied governments had at their disposal are non-existent. Actually, this is a government which not only doesn't control its territory, but a part of its territory is controlled by a government which the British, French in 1940, and American later on allies are not in state of war, and this is the Soviet Union. The peculiar situation of being in exile, completely dependent upon the goodwill, political support, and financial support of the Western allies, first the French government, then the British government, made the position of this government, including in Jewish matters, different than it could have been otherwise, for better and for worse, which I will try to explain. And the most dramatic proof of this dependence came at the end of war, right after the war, when the great powers withdrew its recognition in summer of 1945 and put it on the de facto communist-dominated government in Warsaw at that time. So theoretically and counterfactually, we can imagine a similar situation during the war. Of course, it didn't happen, but it shows the fragility and the dependency of the Polish politicians in exile on this support. Without this support, this was a symbolic national committee without much to say. It didn't have much to say in the post-war years. Legally, this government existed up to 1991. Up to late 1990. It only confirmed the insignia of the Second Polish Republic to President Wałęsa in New Democratic Poland. But of course, it was politically powerless after summer of 1945. In terms of financial dependence, it's a dependence, however, it also shows certain asset that the Polish government in exile had while the French National Committee or the Czechoslovak National Committee didn't. It could take credits as the future government of Poland. Okay? It was not only the goodwill of the French or the British to offer some money. There was a collateral back in the occupied country. The idea that you may have a state without the control of the territory was helpful in these terms. And third, that was a government which emerged in a way of a coup d'etat, because it was in September 1939 when the pre-war Polish government and the commander-in-chief crossed the border on September 17, facing the Soviet invasion from the east and western part of Poland already being occupied by the German army. Crossing the border to Romania, it was unclear what would happen. Initially, they thought about droit de passage, that means the pre-war Romanian promise to let anyone across the territory to the Allied friends, but the Romanians arrested, interned Polish politicians, would help the opponents of the pre-war regime, being in exile, to form a government which was politically very different from the pre-war governments. And I stress it because the pre-war government, the Polish government of the late 1930s, was not famous for being philo-Semitic, actually the opposite. And it was one of the factors that made Polish Jewish leaders in exile hopeful that the former opponents of the governments of the late 1930s, will also oppose the anti-Jewish policies as they were in 1938 or 1937. So you have a very complex situation, both from the legal point of view. I would need to stress that this was a government in exile thanks to a some luck, a good fortune, namely that the Polish Constitution of 1935 previewed that in the case of war, the president can appoint a new cabinet. So there was no need for election. The president, being in exile in Romania, could appoint his successor, being in Paris, and then the new cabinet, and in this way continue the legitimate legal status of this group as a government of exile. Otherwise, it could have been just a national committee. But these governments had some assets. One was the Polish army in exile, which was largely lost with the defeat of France. 80,000 strong Polish army was lost. Only a small minority was evacuated to Great Britain, some 30,000 men in the summer of 1940, but still at that time, it was the biggest force allied with Great Britain, which otherwise was rather alone in its struggle against Nazi Germany. In particular, a small number of Polish pilots played a crucial role in the battle for England in the summer and fall of 1940. So that was one asset. The other was the underground, so-called Polish underground state in occupied Poland, especially its military wing, the Home Army, which was one of the best developed underground army in human history. However, there is a little misunderstanding about when it became strong. It wasn't strong in 1940, 1941. It became strong actually late 1942, 43 and onwards. But it's still, this government commanded a lot of authority among the occupied population and had a substantial underground network, people ready to risk their life for the common causes of fighting the Nazi Germany. And I would say that was probably the greatest contribution of this government, the intelligence network. And this brings us back immediately to the topic of the Holocaust, because the key role of the government in exile was in transmitting the news from occupied Poland, the main land of the Holocaust in Europe, and also, as Ambassador said, Polish Jews made the majority of all the victims of the Holocaust. By any estimates, some 3 million Polish Jews who perished in the Holocaust made most of all the victims of the Holocaust. So in transmission of the news, this government played the key role, and then in the distribution of the news, the government did more, I would say, than any government in the world, but it also had a special responsibility because it represented the biggest group of the victims of the Holocaust, by definition. So you have this capacity to transmit information. You also have capacity to do something in the country, which became clear only in the second half of war. It wasn't yet clear in 1940, 1941. Speaking about the political legitimacy of this government, as I said, it was the government built upon the former opponents of the post-Piłsudski, the Piłsudskite authoritarian regime of the late 1930s. And its pillars were the four parties, three big parties: the Socialist Party, the Nationalist Party, the Peasant Party, and a smaller one, Christian Democrats, who simply were taken into the group of Big Three because Prime Minister Sikorski was in very friendly terms with them. So the Big Four, as we call them, Big Four, made the political basis of the government. So at one hand, this government represented all the citizens of Poland, but politically, these four parties shaped its policies, and a different degree at different moments. And what is interesting, these four parties were ethnic Polish parties. Of course, the National Democrats, the anti-Semitic party of pre-war Poland, was by definition not a party that could represent the Jews or had any Jews among their members or board. The Peasant Party, because of the peculiar ethno-social structure, while the Jews very, very rarely were farmers in pre-war Poland, the Peasant Party was also a non-Jewish party. Christian Democratic Party, by definition, didn't have Jewish members. So only the Socialist Party actually represented some of the Jewish workers in pre-war Poland, still competing with the Socialist Bund or cooperating with Socialist Bund, and it had some prominent leaders of Jewish origin or simply Jewish. So another layer of complexity that I'm adding, not to make you more confused than you may already be, but to stress that a simple monocausal explanation rarely work in this field. And I spent some time trying to discover the origins of some policies and never found anyone that you can explain with a single key that was for or against something. Usually it was a consequence of conflicting interests, conflicting opinions that bring about a result which is usually exactly by the intention of people who initiated it. Well, when I say that it represented all the citizens, well, this is not true. This is not true because during the war, both occupiers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, made great efforts to partition Poland not only territorially, but also in terms of population. The best known case is the so-called the Deutsche Volksliste, the German plan to recover German blood living among the Slavic population of Poland by allegedly voluntary, but in many regions compulsory, joining the list of ethnic Germans, including the grandfather of our previous prime minister, who was given an option between going to the concentration camp with his family or signing the Deutsche Volksliste. And that was, a significant number of people, especially in Silesia and Pomerania, actually a major part of the male population joined. And then they were the cannon fodder for Wehrmacht in the later stage of war. The Soviets, equally, although they had shorter time of rule on occupied Poland, on less than 2 years, they also encouraged Ukrainians, Belarusians, to a less extent Lithuanians, and Jews to distance themselves from pre-war Poland. And as you may remember, the official reason for the Soviet army invasion on Poland was to protect national minorities in Eastern Poland against the chaos of war. And that was to delegitimize the pre-war Polish state as well. And actually, at the beginning, only 2 countries claimed that Poland ceased to exist, and that was Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And then some of the allies joined them in the recognition, if this is the proper English word, the contrary of recognizing the government exile. Some government claimed that this is just a group of men of Polish origin who happened to be in Paris. Certainly, a significant part of the German minority in Poland welcomed the German army, and they voluntarily joined the German Volksliste. And the degree of treason is very well known, which made politicians in exile start thinking in the ethnic terms, not only in terms of we represent all the Polish citizens, but some of the Polish citizens have not been loyal, so maybe we don't represent them. And that was very clear for the Germans. But the index, because of the anti-Jewish inclination, were very quick to point that, some Jews cooperated with the Soviets. Why should we represent the interests of the Jews if they were disloyal? And this remained a constant topic. Actually, even when most of Polish Jews were dead, some of the NDEC politicians were raising this issue. Jews were disloyal under the Soviet occupation, so in fact, in the future, we probably may treat them differently in an ethnic polls. And this you can see in the structure of the government in exile. The government in exile consisted of 3 components: the president, who was the head of the state, the cabinet, and the National Council, which was a quasi-parliamentary body appointed by the president to represent different political interests. And in this body, since the beginning of 1940, there was a Jewish representative, a Zionist from Krakow, Ignacy Schwarzbart, who has been mentioned several times in this room already. And later on, he was joined by a Bundist. And these were the only non-ethnic Polish members of the council. Namely, there was no representation of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, or Germans. And this is to stress the peculiar nature of the Polish government in exile, that it was, yes, a government representing all the nation in the civic sense of this nation, but at the same time, it followed the pattern developed by the Polish national movement back in the 19th and early 20th century as the movement for Poland's independence by mostly ethnic Poles. So the ethno-nationalist component of thinking was very present, especially among the politicians of the right, who simply said minorities are unreliable. Ethnic Germans cooperated with the Germans, Jews and many Belarusians and others cooperated with the Soviets. The only people you can trust are ethnic Poles. So this is the general background, and now let me tell you a few words about what was happening with the government policy in Jewish matters before they learned about what we call today the Holocaust. And they learned it only summer 1942 is probably the first moment, but still I doubt that many of them understood. They had, as Michael Fleming said, the knowledge of what was going on in occupied Poland against the Jews. And in this period, we basically see two major topics in the discussions between the government, its various agencies, and Polish Jewish leaders in exile. And there were quite a number of them. Quite a number of them managed to escape. They established the representation of Polish Jews, which was based in Palestine and consisted of those who were refugees, but also a couple of prominent Polish Jewish politicians who had settled in British Palestine before the war, like Itzhak Grunbaum, for example. So there was a political representation of Polish Jews, and Ignacy Schwarzbart was supported by this political representation of Polish Jews. And the key topic of discussions between them and members of the government, and also discussions in the National Council, was not about what was going in occupied Poland, not at all. It was what will happen in Poland after the war. Especially in the early years of war, the defeat of France, evacuation to Britain, when not even impact, but contact with the occupied country was very limited. It was before the government established relatively reliable channels of communication with occupied Poland. Its influence on the country was rather limited. So most of the debate concentrated on the future. And here, the agenda was set up by Jewish leaders, which basically had three key topics. One was the full and actual equality. Pre-war Poland promised equality to all the Jews in the constitution and formally, but in practice it wasn't the case. And by the way, yesterday eloquent paper on President Roosevelt made Polish anti-Semites appear less badly to me than they were, because it seems that the numerus clausus they were introducing at the Warsaw University was the Harvard standard at that time, which I was surprised to learn. So the Jewish leaders in exile first demanded guarantees for the future equality of the Jews in Poland. Second, they wanted integration, and especially it was a Schwarzbart idea. He, despite being a Zionist, a general Zionist, he didn't believe in any massive migration of East European Jews to Palestine. And he was very critical of the new Zionist organization. And with due respect to the place where we are, to quote him, he said that this is the revisionist Zionists were the Don Quixote of the Jewish nationalism. It's completely, and he wrote in 1941, okay? So he believed that most of the Jews will remain, and he, as the Jewish leader, must build a solid future for this Jewry by cooperation with Polish leaders, by fighting for independent Poland. And specifically, that was the third point, he and others were fighting against so-called emigrationism. Emigrationism was an idea which permeated most of the Polish leadership before the war, namely, the only way to solve the so-called Jewish question is to make as big number of the Jews as possible emigrate somewhere. This is, by the way, the basis for the support for the Zionist revisionists and anyone who was willing to encourage Jews to emigrate, and one of the frictions between Poland and Great Britain in this topic. So these are the three topics which Schwarzbart, later on Zygielbojm and other leaders, also British Jewish leaders who were in touch with the Polish Jewish leaders, were constantly raising in the debates. And they had some success, at least declaratory success, namely two important government declarations. One in November 1940, and then again repeated even stronger, with more precise, in February 1942, which stressed the future full actual equality of the Jews and other minorities, although, of course, the index added other loyal minorities to leave the question open, and we know why. Now we have access to cables between the index in London and in underground in Poland, where they explain to their colleagues in Poland, well, we understand that you may be critical of this declaration. This is not our policy. We do it for the English and the Americans, and this is why we add the word loyal. That in the future we will define who was loyal and who was not. So that was a little gate left by the index for a possible future suspension of this declaration. But three other parties, and that means the great majority I mean, politically speaking, the great majority of the government in exile was strongly for, and especially the Peasant Party was for, because the fact that the socialists were for was obvious. Socialists were very strongly against discrimination against minorities. They closely cooperated with several Jewish parties. But the Peasant Party, exactly because it was a party in between the nationalists and the socialists, and it didn't have an ideology, so it was the most flexible. And in practical terms, the position of the Peasant Party was deciding. If they decided to support a motion, it passed through the National Council. If they were against it, it didn't. And we have a pattern. Several motions submitted by the Jewish members of the National Council, and the result is almost always decided by the vote of the Peasant Party. If the Peasant Party supports, Christian Democrats, who are a small group, follow the Peasant Party. And this way you have a clear majority to support it. Usually the index were against, as a rule. And now we come back to one moment when the Bundists and the index have a common motion in late 1942. So we have this declaration, and it seemed, okay, that's good. We have achieved what we have. The next topic which the Polish Jewish leaders in exile were working on was taking care of the Polish Jews in exile. That means outside of German-occupied Europe. And there were quite a number of them, first in France, but the biggest was in the Soviet Union. And here we come back to the Soviet question and the question of the Eastern Poland, because Soviet Union occupied in 1939 48% of the Polish territory, including a significant portion of Polish Jews, including refugees from Central Poland who managed to escape, like the family of Professor Wistrich, to the Soviet-occupied zone. And many of them were lucky to be victims of Stalinist persecution, deported to Kazakhstan or Siberia. Okay, that was a sign of luck because they were very, very far away from the German army in 1944. Some of them managed to escape when the German army was approaching. Some of them simply found a job in the Soviet interior. And Polish politicians believed that in this case, Jews may show some reciprocity. Namely, yes, we declare future equality of Jews in Poland, and now you need to help us with your brethren in England and America and elsewhere. And Polish politicians very much believe in the powerful Jewish lobby. I would say even the greater anti-Jewish prejudice they had, the stronger they believed in this lobby. The index were the first to believe that there is a powerful Jewish lobby in America. And they believed that the conflict between Poland and the Soviet Union about Eastern Poland, this is a litmus test for the Jewish cooperation. This is why they were a little bit disappointed that Jewish organizations in the world were not eager to criticize the Soviet Union, to condemn the Soviet Union. Here kind of a marking point was the execution of Alter and Ehrlich. Well, today we know that one was a case of suicide, but at that time, look, two of them were killed by the Soviets in the Soviet prison, and Polish politicians very strongly were prodding Jewish organization to support the Polish government in condemnation or to condemn on their own the Soviet government for a crime committed against two Jewish leaders, two Bundist leaders from Poland, which actually didn't come. So, as you see, before the news of the Holocaust came, there were plenty of topics where certain patterns of discussion, patterns of decision-making were developed. And here we come, I can go to the matter of reacting to the Holocaust. Of course, reacting to the Holocaust means reacting to the news of the Holocaust. There was no few people had direct experience like, Jan Karski and some other emissaries from occupied Poland who were eyewitness to what happened. And we could speak about their own reaction. But for others, it was information passed through several hands. And this is a topic very well covered by several scholars. So I'm not going to go deeper into it. However, it was one of the demands of the leaders of the Jewish underground in Poland. Notify the world, convey the message. It was a kind of a precondition for any reactions of the West. And yes, the government in exile did it, although, as we know, sometimes in a selective way. Sometimes you have strange delays. Sometimes some of the cables were not disclosed to Jewish leaders for reasons we are not pretty sure about what they are. And I think that the discussion, which some 20 years ago I took part with David Engel about the motivation of the Polish leaders in exile to spread the news or keep them secret at certain moments. I don't think it's resolved completely now. The second demand, logically, and the most important, was the demand for retaliation. And reading the program of this conference and being in some other conferences about the reactions to the Holocaust by Allied government, what strikes me very often is the attention paid to this demand to bomb Auschwitz or the railroads to Auschwitz. That was late. I mean, yes, Polish government raised the issue already in 1941 when there were few Jews, and that was not yet a killing center. But as an instrument of saving the Jews, it's 1944. At that time, 80% of Polish Jews had been already killed. Actually, 80% of Polish Jews had been killed by the end of 1942. So most of the Polish government did or did not, which was late 1942, early 1943, was already delayed. But the demand to retaliate, when you read the cables from the Polish underground to London, but transmitting messages coming from the Jewish National Council or the leaders of underground, the Bund, this is the key demand, especially in the fall of 1942. Demand the free world, demand the world Jewry to retaliate against Germany. And they were very specific in this. To bomb civilian targets in Germany and take German prisoners of war as hostages. What I'm surprised by is a very limited attention given to this topic in the scholarship. It's not widely covered a topic, while it was the demand. Anything that's later, it was, let's say, that was 70% of the demands coming from the underground. 30% was everything else, and I will mention this in a minute. The government in exile took this demand, and the information campaign in late 1942, early 1943 was to build an emotional atmosphere to submit it. Actually, the letter from Minister Eden to Churchill, which you have seen before the break, was exactly a reaction to the Polish government demands for retaliation that was dropping leaflets. Bombing German cities and dropping leaflets, this is retaliation for the crimes you commit against civilian population in occupied Europe. If you continue, we will continue bombing you. So Eden put from the argument that, well, if they stop killing civilians, should we stop bombing the German cities? That's rather impractical during the war. But three other arguments against this demand were, first, we cannot compete in barbarity with the Nazis. Very good argument. Second, it's impractical. They will not stop it. We cannot make it. Third, Germans at that time, late 1943, early 1940, late 42, early 43, had many more Allied prisoners of war and civilian slave workers in their hands than the Allies had German prisoners of war. So there was a fear that if, let's say, British government decides to decimate a group of German prisoners of war, the Germans may kill 10 times more of them. Okay, so you have a number of arguments which eventually led to the dismissal. To my knowledge, only Churchill did consider seriously the issue, and probably Eden's response is one of the feedback information he got, and he found stiff resistance to the idea in his cabinet. So he was probably the only. There was some critical remarks made about Churchill in this war, but apparently he was the only person to seriously consider this demand, nobody else. Polish government was very eager to make it, not only, and I would say not probably even not primarily to save the Jews, but Polish government was very much afraid that the extermination of the Jews is a first step of a German policy to continue with non-Jews, which seemed to be confirmed in the fall of 1942, when Germans started deportation of Polish peasants from the Zamość region, which was a kind of a pilot project for the General Plan Ost. Massive deportation, settling German settlers, and so on. And we have the cables from the Polish underground, do something. Do something. Try to do something to stop it. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen, and there are some attempts later on to make it, but without much hope in it being effective. And I told you that there was only one moment when the index in the National Council voted strongly with the Jews, and that was exactly two motions, actually three motions, submitted at the end of 1942, exactly to demand retaliation and other strong measures by the Allied governments, a motion in the National Council. One was submitted by Zygielbojm, the other by Mrs. Zaleska, who was, she was proud of her anti-Semitism. And Mr. Jóźwiak, who before the war had been affiliated to the National Radical kind of a fascist party, in fact. So very strange bedfellows, but they had a very similar understanding that there is a horrible German policy which first affects Jews, but then may be expected to non-Jewish Poles, and we must do something about it. Ineffective. So the next demand of the Jewish leaders in Poland was that the government, and Sikorski personally, appeals to the Polish population to help Jews who are hiding outside of the ghettos, who are escaping the killing machine. And here the reaction is very different to the reaction of the first demand. Namely, it took 6 months, in fact more than 6 months, of prodding by Schwarzbard, Zygielbojm, and others to eventually have General Sikorski make such declaration in early spring of 1943, when the Warsaw Ghetto was in flames. And why was it so? Exactly because of certain pattern of decision-making that had been developed before the news of the Holocaust came to London. And the pattern was, as I said, the government in exile was the government of national unity. And that was kind of something sacrosanct, that we must be united for the time of war. After the war, we can be divided again. You know, the fact that you have index and socialist on the same government was highly unusual. Before the war, they hated each other, for good reasons. So they suspended the quarrels for the time of war, and there was an unwritten veto power. That means what the socialists found excessively anti-Semitic and the index found excessively philo-Semitic, they could not formally veto, but they could block it. And for the government position, that was used several times. So what we see with this declaration by radio, the appeal to the Poles to help the Jews. Already in 1941 and then in 1942, when there are any attempts to encourage the population in the country into something, one of the parties was saying, we shouldn't teach the people in the countryside. We are in London, we are safe, we don't know very much the conditions. We shouldn't teach them. Let's give them decision. And that was the argument several times against the demand to appeal. Well, usually the response was, the Poles are already helping the Jews. We shouldn't push them, you know, this is very risky. So why Sikorski changed his mind and eventually made an appeal, a very, very strong appeal. Actually, he condemned the cruelty against the Jews. He called his fellow patriots to help the poor victims of the Nazi terror. You know, that was a very strong, clear message in early May 1943. Because he got the message from Warsaw, speak to the ghetto. During the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the position of the Polish underground, especially its military branch, which had been rather critical towards the Jews and towards the ability to fight the Germans, suddenly changed. And in the underground press and the cables to London, we have many expressions of surprise and, well, a very positive surprise. The Jews fight back, and they kill the Germans. And one of the messages was exactly, say something about the glorious struggle of the ghetto. It was meant to the radio station that pretended to broadcast from occupied Poland. It was broadcasting from England, Radio Błyskawica. It pretended to broadcast from Poland. And eventually, Sikorski said it, but the precondition was there. The leaders of the underground in Poland gave a signal, now you can speak. Before that moment, Sikorski didn't feel in a position to make it, especially against the opposition of the index. And the index, why they didn't want it? Because they kept in mind the anti-Semitic constituency back in Poland. They were getting messages from their colleagues in Poland that they don't like what the government does in Jewish matters. These declarations, which I mentioned, were systematically criticized by the index in the underground. Now, they kept this little gate that the Jews were disloyal, for possibly dismantled in the future, and the only claim for the index in London to be in the government was that they represent the index back in occupied Poland. So you have a very complex political system, half of it in the underground Poland, half of it in London, which can encourage the government to do something, or prevent it to do something, or delay its action or inaction. There were also other demands. Let me just mention them. One was to send money to help the Jews in hiding, and it was gradually developed. Initially, the Council for the Żegota, the Council for the Assistance to the Jews, was operating on the government funds only. Later on, Jewish organization added substantial amounts of money to this undertaking, and to secure safe havens in neutral countries, and they support in saving Jews in other European countries. And here we go back to the very peculiar neutral country, which was Vatican. And the Pope was the head of the State of Vatican, and also he was the head of the Roman Catholic Church. And several times Polish ambassadors to Vatican were approaching the Pope, the leading figures in the Holy See, for declarations against the German barbarity in occupied Europe. And usually they were very disappointed. Many, many months before Polish ambassador approached the Holy See in reference to the slaughter of the Jews, they tried to make the Pope say something about the persecution of Catholic popes, which didn't happen. So the relations between Poland and the Vatican, the government exile and the Vatican, were rather strained in that time. So this again was of limited success. So as I would like to leave some time for the questions, let me quote the most insightful statement on the Polish government exile written at that time by the most qualified person. And this person was Szmul Zygielbojn in his final letter, which he wrote to the Polish president and the prime minister before committing suicide in May 1943 in London, where he wrote, "Although the Polish government contributed in a great degree to moving the public opinion of the world, yet this was insufficient. Yet the government did not bring itself for something extraordinary which would be commensurate with the scale of the drama that takes place in the country." And I think the word commensurate is the key. We have heard here many words of disappointment with British, American governments, and we can say some words of disappointment about the Polish government in exile. But the question is, what was commensurate? What was the commensurate reaction to the Holocaust? On the government level and on the individual level. The extreme reaction, and that was the only man to my knowledge who did it, was the suicide, and that was by a Bundist. And Schwarzbart commented after his death, well, he did it, I didn't, because I have religion, which he as a Marxist didn't, and I have Yishuv, I have my Zionist ideas. He was hanging only on Polish Jewry back in Poland, which is now no longer. At that time, Schwarzbart understood it already. So if this is the commensurate, and let us see that this is not, first, it was ineffective politically. Okay, it didn't change anything. If Zygielbojn committed suicide to make someone do something, it never happened. So even if it was commensurate, it was ineffective. And thinking in terms of the government policies, what were the policy options considered at that time, it seems to me that there were two parallel processes. Namely, alongside a reduction of the figures coming from occupied Poland of the number of killed Jews, and we can see it, that gradual politicians reduced them to make them appear more reliable. Both Polish and Jewish politicians exiled. It was only Zygielbojn who always gave the figure from the reports without clarifications. And others thought that he was exaggerating, at least up to the late 1942. There was a similar process of watering down possible political options. What is feasible? This is not feasible, that is not feasible, because reasonable people don't do it. Including reasonable people don't bomb civilian targets in Germany. They don't kill German women and children in retaliation to stop German crimes. Is there a reasonable political option commensurate to the Holocaust? I don't know. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we'll be glad to answer. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for your remarks and information. It was very elucidating of the Polish government. But I have some remarks or questions that I'd like to ask you.
please.
When you explain the complexity of the Polish government in exile over issuing certain declarations, such as helping people in the Jewish refugees in the countryside, etc., explain it. However, how can one stand by and ask, without bringing other facts into the picture, as to the inability of those Jews to escape from their Nazi tormentors, being found, taken over by Poles, and given back to their Nazis? If this declaration had come in spite of the political difficulties, don't you think that the Polish people might have looked differently upon this whole issue, and thousands upon thousands of lives have been saved? Secondly, my father himself, of blessed memory, served in the Polish underground. He was a Polish citizen. He served in the Polish army between the two wars, and the son of a Polish citizen. Thank God I was an Israeli citizen. I want to ask you, how is it possible? How is it possible that I grew up with stories that the Polish underground, the very group that you say was under the direction of the Polish government in exile, was extremely anti-Semitic to the point of Jews who joined this Polish underground fearing for their lives or having their lives wiped out?
Okay, so let me make 3 points. First, the government made immediately, after the German attack against the Soviet Union, that means entering Eastern Poland, we immediately have an instruction coming from London to remind the population not to collaborate in any way with the German occupiers. That's something else. The declaration of May 1943 was to help the Jews. So the government was ready to instruct the country not to collaborate, but it's a different thing not to collaborate and to risk your life to save a Jew. So in these terms, against collaboration, the policy was very clear since the beginning. Since the beginning, I think there is a strange tendency in the European debates about reactions to the Holocaust. There were such debates in Poland, in Switzerland, in France, in Sweden, of course in Germany and so on, as if being an ally of Nazi Germany or being its enemy didn't matter at all. That means you have these debates without qualification of which side of the war was a given country. And I think that was when you compare, for example, the fate of the Jews in occupied Poland and Lithuania, or the law of ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine, this is the key. What is the decision of the national leadership, in this case government? Are they ready to join Nazi Germany, or are they ready to fight against Nazi Germany? So this is about kind of a general policy of the government. Speaking about, yes, I think that if Sikorski made this declaration, not in May 43, but in May 42, he could have saved probably a few thousand lives. Yes, that's true. He couldn't have stopped the Holocaust, but the marginal difference could have been there. Although, in fact, I have found in one of the memoirs that one of the people who extended help to the Jews did it because he heard it on radio. So at least we can say this is a particular case when a Polish citizen who heard Sikorski on radio speaking from London did something for a Jew who was outside seeking help. Speaking about the collaborators, or those who were, so the black szmalcownicy, the extortionists who were preying on Jewish tragedy for their personal interest, that means not so much collaborating with the Germans, but rather extracting money for the Jews in hiding for their private purposes. The underground did, but again, quite late in 1943, to punish them. And we have a few cases when they were executed. First, the underground tribunals sentenced them as traitors. And they were traitors, and a literal meaning. And we know that the communists after the war prosecuted such people. Now, when we have access to files, this way we know how it was going on. But I'm pretty sure that if the government, the Polish government exile returned from exile to Poland, as for example, the Norwegian government in a return, it could have prosecuted the collaborators because it was an act of treason. cooperating with the German police or Gestapo, and it was an act of treason. So I think in this sense, we have a social problem, namely people who, either because of their anti-Semitic prejudice or for money or for any reasons, betray the Jews to the Germans. But this is not a national problem. The national leadership policy was very clear: don't do it. Okay? And these people were traitors, in this sense. The people who collaborated with Germany were traitors. Yes. Oh, of course it did. Information did already. I actually found probably the first information about mass shooting. It's I think August 1941 when it reached London. That means relatively soon after the beginning of the mass shooting. But still, you must remember that in terms of timing, Polish underground under Soviet occupation was much more effectively destroyed than under German occupation. The Soviets were much more effective. So when Germans invaded Eastern Poland, there was no Polish underground in this area. So there was no networks of communication to convey it. But this information reached London repeatedly in late 1941, early 1942. You have plenty of reports. Moreover, British government, the top leaders of the British government had very detailed information about this from the decoded German reports. And that was the top secret information. They had the head counts of the Jewish victims of mass shooting. Well, 1 million includes also Soviet Jews, but they had reports of the Einsatzgruppen from specific localities which gave numbers. We shot 742 people in this place. So that was rather a matter of disclosing information than conveying it from Eastern Europe. Responding, because I didn't say about the underground. No underground organization, even including the anti-Semitic right, the National Armed Forces, had a policy to kill the Jews. But there were anti-Semites in the underground who did it, but certainly not the Home Army. There was no policy, and when we have a case during the Warsaw Uprising of a group of soldiers killing a group of Jews who emerged from hiding in the ruins of Warsaw, then you have a military prosecutor investigating the case, searching the murders. So there is a social problem of anti-Semites for reasons we don't know killed these people, but there's another problem of a policy being anti-Jewish.
Let's have a couple of more questions, perhaps, but let's, if you could ask brief questions so that we could round up the session. We're better to running over time.
Yes.
Since we're sitting at the ladies' I'd like to ask about the items in reference to the war effort across
Menachem Begin was among the 100,000 plus Polish citizens who were allowed to leave the Soviet Union. Again, something unprecedented. The first biggest group of people who knew what is the Soviet regime, I would say, from first hand, who are allowed to leave. But among this 100,000 plus people, there were only a few thousand Jews. A consequence of a discriminatory approach of some of the Polish officers who simply believed Jews were not good soldiers. And some of them believed Jews collaborated with the Soviets and they may be Soviet spies. But also Soviet policy, very intelligent Soviet policy of denying this right, not liberating from the places of deportation non-ethnic Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Jews. That was another step in undermining Polish claims to Eastern Poland. So, but Begin left with the Anders army, and then formally he deserted in Palestine, but practically he did it by agreement with his commanders, like many other Jewish soldiers. And there is some scholarship about it, especially the peculiar situation of the Polish military leadership facing the British military leadership, and Polish soldiers not willing to cooperate with the British military police in pursuing of these armed Jews. So British were very unhappy about it, that Polish army brought a number of military trained armed Jews to to the Palestine. But that was clearly, there was an unwritten permission by Anders and his officers to let these people go.
One more quickie. You have mentioned possible bombing in Auschwitz or the rail lines leading to. Are there rail lines that are close proximity to Auschwitz that Germans used to fly or after Ireland to transport material and personnel? I'm just wondering if the Allied excuse saying it wasn't a significant military target, but if those rail lines in any near proximity to Auschwitz used by Germany for flight purposes, it would seem strategically logical point.
This is just an excuse. Of course, Allies were bombing Auschwitz, all the concentration. There was, the satellite camps and the factories. The German built the artificial oil factory, the chemical factory. They were bombing. Actually, you can see the pictures in the lobby. There are pictures where you can see the shell craters after Allied bombing. So this is an excuse. But it had one practical aspect, namely, the single biggest deportation to Auschwitz was the deportation of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews in 2 months in summer 1944. And this went via 2 railroad lines only. So again, counterfactually, destroying these 2 lines could have saved Hungarian Jewry at that time. But so the Allies refused for different reasons than not having a target in the vicinity of the camp. The question is, would it stop the Holocaust? Some people claim that even destroying the gas chambers wouldn't stop it, because at the moment when there were too many prisoners for the capacity of the gas chambers, they established a kind of a makeshift gas chambers in a couple of huts outside of the camp. And then, for the history of Polish Jews were killed elsewhere, mostly. In Bełżec, Treblinka, Sobibór, and that, in 1944 it was over. And the camps were actually destroyed in 1943. Thank you very much.